All right, welcome everyone to the February meeting of the OpenZFS leadership team. We have a few things on the agenda, and we'll probably have time for additional items if folks want to discuss after that. Why don't we kick it off with the thread priorities question that you had, Paul?
Certainly. So to provide a little bit of context to everyone, we were doing some performance analysis on ZFS send on Illumos and Linux, and we noticed that there were some discrepancies in the performance behavior. And when we dug into it further, we found that on both Illumos and on Linux, we create the send-related threads with sort of the minimum available priority. But on Illumos, as Matt pointed out to me, all kernel threads are higher priority than all userland threads. Even the lowest priority kernel threads are higher than the highest priority userland threads. Whereas on Linux, they share the same priority space. And so we were creating the threads with effectively a much lower priority on Linux than we were on Illumos. We solved this, or at least worked around this issue by increasing the priority that we created the bottlenecking threads at. But I thought it was worth bringing up in general how we want to deal with this issue, where we're sort of getting different performance characteristics on different operating systems because they have different thoughts about thread priorities and stuff like that. So does anybody, I don't know exactly what the state of affairs is on BSD. Does it sort of more closely resemble Linux or Illumos?
On FreeBSD, we have all same as probably like on the Lumos, like when all kernel threads have higher priorities in the user space. It's possible to set priority lower, but kernel threads never work as the timeshare. So they practically, it's a fixed priority. So it's possible to even make them same as user space.
Okay, so it sounds like of the three sort of primary platforms, Linux is sort of the outlier in terms of behavior.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. I think, if I recall correctly, we had some old issues too, where we had to tinker with the thread priorities a little bit because they're very different than the other platforms and how they're interpreted too, what the values mean.
Right.
Not just how they're interpreted in user space. If I remember right, they're inverted or something like that. So there's code to handle that. Mm-hmm. There may have been some minor investigation of performance in the original issue for that, but I'm sure it's stale at this point.
Yeah, so I mean, in general, I think like I'm not inherently opposed to the performance being different on different platforms. I think different operating systems do things differently. But it does seem like even just looking at Linux in isolation, there's at least some of these threads that that ZFS is creating that are effectively at very low priority. Like, user threads can easily take precedence over the threads that we're creating. And I think there's two classes, right? One is threads that we're creating that are like doing work that the user explicitly requested right then, like the send thing, where it's like, you could have the user process's thread is at some priority. We're creating another thread to do the work for it, like the send prefetching or that's going off and doing stuff as part of the send operation that you asked us to do. Those are actually running at lower priority than the user thread is running at, which seems like, that kind of seems wrong on its face. Then separately, we have like the background threads that are kind of doing work for the whole system, like the ZIO threads and the think thread or threads now. And those, like, I think you could kind of make arguments either way, like, hey, we should be super polite. We should not be too high priority, this background stuff, because otherwise we can just like clobber all of, the user's CPU. So we should probably think about those two cases maybe separately. But I think that in practice, setting ourselves to be the lowest priority is like not a good recipe.
When it comes to things like the send threads that we're spinning up sort of to serve a user thread or a user prompted command, it would seem like a reasonable default would be to try to just copy whatever priority the send thread has, like the main send thread, and just use that as the priority for all of its child threads.
And do you know if we copy that, is that like a?
It's just an integer, I think. So if it gets changed later, it won't be updated dynamically or anything.
Yeah, and would it be changed later as a result of like dynamic scheduling decisions, where like the system is noticing, hey, like you're using a lot of CPU, I'm going to lower your priority, like because Illumos does that kind of stuff within the user priorities, or is it just if you like reran nice or whatever?
I think it's just if you re-nice, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, if that's the case, then I agree that like creating those send or receive threads just with the same priority as the user thread would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, but we'd have to look into it and see.
And I mean, what are your thoughts, Brian, about the priority of the like truly background threads, like syncing and the zero interrupt stuff and whatnot?
I don't know what the right priority would be offhand. I think it would be nice to maybe have it behave reasonably the same on all platforms. So maybe it's worth investigating putting some kind of generic interface in front of these to get the behavior we want. I don't know. I think we've had issues up in the past before tackling different performance problems, and you tune for one case, you end up breaking another, right?
Yeah.
So. But if someone can propose better defaults for this or that work better, seems reasonable. I'm trying to dig up the old issues, but I'm sure I can come up with them later.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct for stuff like the background threads is that they could be, like even if we don't want to try to mirror the behavior that we have on Illumos, where we are sort of higher priority than all user land threads, we could try to have a behavior where we are at least not like the lowest priority, we're a few notches above there, so that way like default threads would still, have priority. But then if somebody was trying to be super nice, we would get to go ahead of them. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, something like that, or or maybe being like the highest priority that you can. So if you think of it as like we're doing background, we're doing the work that the user asked us to do. We have to do this work in order to like do what they already asked us to do before to write stuff out. I think that it does kind of make sense to be at least as high as, if not higher priority than user threads, so that if somebody, like say somebody who's not doing ZFS stuff, they're just, compressing their video or whatever, and they're like, oh, I'm going to run at the highest priority that I can. And then therefore like totally starve out somebody who's, doing writes. That doesn't seem like a great behavior.
Yeah, we also want to avoid cases where, like, for latency sensitive work like the ZIL, we don't want any of the task queues there to get starved out, because we want to do that work as fast as possible. So it may not be, we may not be able to apply like the same heuristic across the board, but sorry, go ahead, Brian.
No, I was going to say, yeah, I think that makes sense. I don't think we want to starve the ZFS threads in general, at least like Matt was saying. We have a couple categories here, right, of threads that have important work that needs to get done now, and then some of the lower priority background stuff that, we don't care eventually when it gets to it, like something of a background task.
Sure. But there's not many of those threads that we don't care about the performance of. Like, even the SPA sync, even though it's like totally asynchronous, usually nobody's explicitly waiting on it, but the performance of that thread directly impacts like your overall write bandwidth that we can do. So, if you are trying to write stuff as fast as possible, then the performance of that thread is important. All right. So it sounds like
we may have a little bit more leeway on like the read issue threads, where we could take the same priority as the thread that's actually executing that work.
Yeah.
But I mean, But then you talk about like prefetch threads, and well, you don't want those guys to be starved out.
Yeah. It sounds like there's at least consensus that we should reevaluate this and look at giving the ZFS threads better priority. So, Paul, are you interested in kind of doing that and putting together a PR for people to comment on? Or should we just kind of put that on our list of tasks for the future?
I don't know that I have the bandwidth to work on it right now, but in the sometime in the near future, I would be interested in being involved in it. But also, if somebody else is interested in working on it, that would also be fun.
Okay.
I think as part of that work, it would be worth going through each of the threads we create and like making a conscious decision about why its priority is the way it is.
Yeah, that would be a big part.
I'm not sure that's been thought about in a long time.
All right, cool. Well, I think we'll put that on the list of reasonable things to propose specific PR for in the future. Cool. The next topic is related to continuing the discussion that we started last month about the feature flags and new compression and checksum algorithms. Alan, do you want to kind of summarize where we're at, and did you have a specific proposal that you wanted to kind of get feedback on?
Yeah. So while testing the changes for Z standard, we found that if you set the compression type on a data set to Z standard, but then don't write any blocks, it doesn't activate the feature flag. So then if you export that pool and then import it on another machine that's running like 0.8 or whatever and doesn't know what Z standard is, then you hit assertions that the compression type is out of the range of the enum. And so we were looking at, as soon as you set it, do we need to activate the feature? But that's more complicated for deactivating the feature. Normally, when you destroy the last data set that was using the feature goes back to being enabled instead of active. But the reference counting gets more complicated if you are increasing the reference count just because somebody changed a property, not because they actually wrote a block. And what's the reasonable thing to do? Whether it's, when we expanded the list of checksums with SHA-512 and so on, we didn't seem to run into this problem because, how often are you going to set the property but not write any blocks? But what do we want to do about it?
Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, from your initial description, definitely it sounds to me like the sort of most objectively, or the most correct behavior is the sort of reference tracking when the property has been set and when objects have been set with that as their compression type. But I believe you when you say that that's more complicated to do. I'm just saying that sounds like sort of the one that most accurately reflects the way that I would expect the system to work. As a user and as a developer, and so it has that going for it as one of its positive attributes. But of course, if it's extremely difficult to implement, that's a big mark against it.
Yeah, I agree with what Paul said, and I think we should look at that solution some more. Did you I don't think it's inherently intractable because when we're changing the property or deleting the data set or whatever, we're in syncing, we have to go to syncing context to do that. And syncing context is where we would need to be to increment or decrement the future ref count as well.
Yeah, currently the increment of the ref count happens in the block birth function if this is going to activate the feature and the feature's not activated, then we need to increase the ref count or whatever.
Yeah, and it's not actually bumping the ref count there. It's setting this flag, this DS
Right.
activation flag, which tells it to then do it in syncing context.
Right.
I'm guessing that then we do it in dataset sync.
And if we did something like that for as soon as they set the property, because there's a callback that triggers with that, I think the problem was if they never actually wrote any blocks, how do we know when we can decrement the ref count?
Well, I think that currently, when do we decrement the ref count?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think that it's only when the data set is destroyed.
I think so, yes.
So we would keep doing that, and that would be fine. So yeah, I don't remember if we looked at this before, but I mean, I think that we should at least try harder to figure out how we would do the activation immediately when you set the property.
So my naive attempt to do that didn't work because setting that flag you found in the birth thing, the callback that the property change CV happens too late or something, and so nothing was ever actually looking at the flag that I set to say, hey, please activate this feature flag.
So I think the problem is with inheritance, right? Because
that too, yep.
When we when you set the property, when you change the property, it applies to everything below that. But I don't know that. I think that you might be right that we go iterate over them in open context. Is that right? Instead of in sneaking context?
I'm not sure.
Well, I think we should go investigate this rather
yes.
I don't think that we need to be like
live debugging it, but
I think that we should somebody should go spend the time to investigate these code paths. And I think that the two ways that we thought about it before were, one is we just bump the ref count kind of using a similar mechanism for all of the file systems where the property takes effect when you do the ZFS set. And the other way that we had talked about last time was maybe we have we say that the ref count is like the sum of all the data sets that have used this new checksum algorithm, which is what it's doing now, plus anywhere that we have explicitly set the property. So in other words, like when you do the ZFS set and it inherits down, we would bump the ref count by 1. And then when you change the property again later, we would decrement the ref count by 1. I think that's like a little bit more complicated. So preferably we could do it with the former mechanism of just saying like, instead of waiting until we write the first block to bump it, we go and explicitly like, enable it for this data set on everything that inherits the property when we do it. And we would need to go, the inheritance that may be non-trivial, but I think that it's probably doable.
Yeah, that seems more reasonable because the other way the problem might be if you set it, that activates the feature. So when the first block is born, it doesn't increment the ref count because the feature is already activated. And then you change the checksum algorithm to a different value, and that would decrement it, but there would actually still be blocks that are using it, and they wouldn't be ref counted correctly.
Yeah, well, I don't think that would be the case with either scheme because, like, in the latter scheme, we would be bumping it both for blocks that are using it, like we are now, and for basically wherever we've set the property. So, like, in other words, one, we would add 1 for each data set that has blocks with this with the new checksum algorithm, and we would bump it for like the property being set.
Right.
So you'd have the ref count of 2, and then if you change the property, then the ref count might go down to 1, but it won't go down to 0 unless you destroy the
Right.
file system. Yeah.
Quick question just about one case and whether it covers it. If you were to set the property on data set, create a file with no blocks, just like touch a file, and then unset the property, would we have an erroneous ref count there? Because I think the file would still have the compression algorithm set to the Z standard, but there wouldn't be any blocks compressed with it.
No, the file, when you create a dnode, the dnode does have a checksum and compression setting specific to it, but I'm 99% sure that that it doesn't like copy the setting into the dnode when you create the dnode. It's just like it can override the file system wide setting. So like basically for all objects outside of the MOS, this setting is always not like the dnode setting is always to inherit whatever is in the file system. There's no way to change it.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I mean, if there was, then we would need to worry about that. But I think because in practice, like that setting is not actually used, then we can just ignore it.
Okay.
Cool. Right. So the other thing that you brought up, Alan, was being able to, like, if you have some data sets that are using some feature flags, being able to import the pool, but not be able to mount those specific data sets. I think that would be a cool extension to the feature flag mechanism in general. But I don't think that we should like, I don't think that should be the solution to this specific problem. Because I think it's going to be like a bunch more complicated. And, you know, as we saw, the problem shows up even when the data set isn't really using the feature flag, it's just that the property is set. So even having the property set and doing like, you know, ZFS list or ZFS get all would get confused about this property value that we don't know about. So I think we can definitely work at like chipping away at that kind of stuff, like saying, oh, like in new versions of ZFS, like we can just, if we see a property value for maybe for specific properties or whatever that we don't understand, then we're just going to say, you know, unknown, and then you get the default. Like, I think that might be a reasonable thing to do, but we should probably consider that kind of orthogonal to these other, to the like very real and concrete problem that we have now, which is like this bug where, you know, we end up letting you import a pool that we really shouldn't. Any more thoughts about these topics? All right, that's all that we had on the agenda. Other stuff folks would like to discuss? I'll let folks know that we're looking at moving the OpenZFS website hosting provider. Just FYI, it's currently it's hosted by Julian, and we kind of got that connection through the Illumos folks who worked at Joyent, and they were hosting also the Illumos infrastructure, like, you know, the Illumos website and whatnot on Joyent. And Joyent was, you know, providing that service without any charge, so that was nice. But most of our kind of contacts within that community aren't working at Joyent anymore. So, kind of for long-term, you know, there's no problem. There's no immediate problem. They're still hosting it. They aren't asking us to move off or anything. But just in terms of making sure that like eventually they might change their minds or they might, forget about us or whatever. So we're looking at moving it to University of Washington, which also hosts a bunch of other like prominent open source projects, websites, and other static hosting infrastructure and stuff. So that's in progress, and that shouldn't be any. We're not planning on changing any of the OSU, OSL in Oregon. We're not planning on changing kind of any of the content of the website. It would just be like the DNS would point somewhere else. And Michael Dexter points out that they also host kernel.org, which is the Linux kernel, among other things. Cool. We would definitely welcome contributions to update the actual content of the website, which is fairly out of date in places. So, I know Michael and Karen have done some work on that at the last hackathon. So, cool. Any other questions or topics?
I have a general question.
I guess I would say one thing, just a quick thing. If I can call for reviews, there's 2 features outstanding that are still looking for some additional reviewers if they want. There's the encryption performance work that was in 9749. It's in pretty good shape. And there's the persistent L2 ARC in ZFS Linux issue 9582. Both are really close for final reviews. So if you have time, take a look.
Cool. The encryption performance one is that just adding the accelerated algorithms, or is that changing the default as well?
Both at the moment, both in that pull request. We could split them out if there's a desire to do that. But yeah, the commit changes the default and accelerates the GSM stuff.
Cool. Yeah, I know we discussed that maybe 1 or 2 months ago at this meeting.
Yeah.
And do you know, did we send out an email on the mailing list about changing the default?
I don't believe so.
All right, let's do that. Send an email on the OpenZFS mailing list, just that folks are aware and can give any feedback about changing the default.
I think we were in agreement here, if I remember right, that was a good idea, right?
Yeah.
I certainly was.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to be, I had asked about that, I think, yesterday, and just because I wanted to be sure if that does happen to keep it consistent, since we're getting real close with the stuff I talked about in November, getting that finished up and making that available. So we don't want to start having people create a whole bunch of pools on CCM, and then all of a sudden, then it's like, oh, well, now everything's GCM, and if you want to switch, well, you basically have to, recreate your pool. So that's why I was asking.
Yeah.
It seemed like a good time that if we're going to make the switch, this is a good time to do it on our side as well.
Cool.
Sounds good.
I did have a quick, just general question. Hopefully, if this isn't.
Go ahead.
I just wondered, FOSDEM just finished up here over the weekend. I think it was this weekend. And with coming up, I know Scale is coming up here in March, and well, I don't think there's anything Lumo specific. Obviously, there's a lot of Linux stuff, and I also saw some BSD stuff. I don't know if there was going to be anything ZFS related, either informal or not. So I'm going just not with work, but just with some friends, and so if there was, I was just going to ask, that way I can make a point to check it out. So I thought I'd ask.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think that Delphix has any plans at either of those conferences. George and I spoke at Scale, I think 1 or 2 years ago. Was it 1 year? It may have just been 1 year ago. Yeah. So last year, George and I spoke at Scale and gave a well-received talk that was kind of an overview of ZFS. And the organizers were very receptive to, having more ZFS talks there in the future. But I don't know if anybody submitted anything for this year. I think if folks are going, then maybe seeing if there's like a possibility of doing a BOF or a meetup there. I think you'd probably find a lot of people that wanted to hear about what's new with ZFS from anyone who's involved in the community. All right, sounds like at least nobody here is going. Oh, Alan mentions that there will be at BSD CAN in June. There's going to be an OpenZFS BOF, and also I know of at least one ZFS related talk that was submitted to BSD CAN. Cool. Oh yeah, I mean, sounds like nobody here is like planning anything for Scale or FOSDEM, but I'd love to see us do more talks there, both just getting the word out, engaging with folks from the broader community beyond OpenZFS, and I think the BSD communities are very well informed about ZFS, but spreading that knowledge to the broader software industry, and I think Linux world specifically would be really advantageous for the project as a whole. I think that's something that Delphix would like to do, but that's just not our focus for this year. And it's also something that I'd like to see the OpenZFS organization be able to do, in the medium to long term, to have to build up funds that we could send people to go, speak at conferences that don't have the funds to do so, from the company or individually, and also to potentially, have or participate in booths and stuff like that. I know that, for example, the FreeBSD community has done a pretty good job of having a booth at Linux conferences and other general technology conferences to kind of get the word out about another project which is probably has less prominence than a lot of the Linux-based ones. So I think kind of following that model would be interesting.
Yeah, FOSDEM for the last couple of years, the FreeBSD and Illumos tables have been side by side and giving out ZFS stickers and so on.
Cool.
I wasn't able to go this year, but last year at FOSDEM I gave ZFS how the ARC caching works talk in the main track, in addition to my usual talk about ZFS in the BSD dev room. But this year I wasn't able to go.
You were on the podcast. I listened to that this morning.
I recorded that one last year with all the Illumos people, and it just took a year to come out.
Cool. It sounds like Michael says that possibly IX systems will be at Scale. I assume that's a booth. Are they talking about IX systems having a booth at Scale and spreading the word about ZFS and FreeBSD and other technologies there?
Thanks. On the subject of podcasts, if anybody is doing interesting work on ZFS and wants to talk about it, the BSD Now podcast will happily arrange an interview.
Cool. All right. Well then, are there any other questions or topics? Okay, then we'll close the meeting. The next meeting will be 4 weeks from today, on March 3rd and it will be at this same time. Yes, it'll be at the same time as today. So we'll see you all then. Thanks.